Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Charles Shapiro, the President of World Affairs Council. Today is the 100th anniversary of the entry in force of the 19th Amendment. It was ratified by Tennessee on August 18th, 1920, but U.S. Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby, a gentleman I had never heard of before, didn't receive the official notification from Tennessee and issue the documentation until August 26, 100 years ago today. I want to welcome the audience. We've got loads of people from the Bank of America and Swiss Re. We've got university, high school students and faculty from the US and the Netherlands, and some people from our sister World Affairs Councils around the country. Today's program is brought to you by the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. If you're not a member, join today. Our moderator is Naima Judge, who is Managing Director of Bank of America's Private Bank. Many of you will remember her as a fabulous panelist at our International Women's Day program in 2019. In about a half an hour, Naima is going to ask questions from the audience. Please send your questions using there's a Q&A function on the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And please help Naima by sending short, direct questions that end in a question mark. That would be really great for her. Naima, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ambassador. It is such a pleasure for me to be here with you today. And thank you all of our guests that are out there in the virtual world. So just thinking about this moment, I really was reflecting. And as a young girl, I remember learning about the women's suffrage movement. Names like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were at the forefront of our history books. And as a matter of fact, many of you probably don't know this, but I am from Rochester, New York, where the home of Susan B. Anthony still stands today, where she lived there for over 40 years and serves as a national museum. While living there, we often took school field trips to that historic home and learned how that was the site of her famous arrest for voting in 1872. But what we weren't taught in class during those field trips was about the many women of color who also made a considerable impact on the suffrage movement. As a young Black girl, I think it would have been amazing at that time to also hear stories of those women, many of whom look like me. So if you hadn't guessed already, I'm not in school anymore, but I am feeling excited about today's conversation and the opportunity to learn what I didn't learn back then. So with me today is Cathleen Cahill. Cathleen is an associate professor of history at Penn State University, where she teaches courses such as Women, Race, and the Right to Vote, and the Emergence of Modern America, 1876 to 1932. Kathleen is a social historian who focuses on women's working and political lives, asking how identities such as race, nationality, class, and age have shaped them. So thank you, Kathleen, for joining me today. So excited to have this conversation with you.
Oh, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here to celebrate with all of you and this audience. And it's a wonderful way to spend the afternoon. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So let's not waste any more time. Let's jump right into this conversation. So Kathleen, take me back to 1920. Ground us a little bit, set the stage. What was it like?
Sure. So 1920 was an incredible moment, right? We're celebrating this anniversary of changing the Constitution. And for women's suffrage advocates, this was a moment that had been years, decades even, in the making. Women had been fighting for suffrage from, really early in the 19th century. And women had been born, had fought for suffrage, and had died before this moment. And one of the things I think to remember in the bigger history is there were, over the course of those decades, a variety of strategies, and changing the federal constitution was only one of those strategies, because of course, the federal Constitution more or less left voting to the state constitutions when it was first created. And so there are two sort of major moments where this strategy of changing the federal Constitution comes up. One's right after Reconstruction, where there are the flurry of Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. And there women suffragists advocate for a 16th, which will eventually become the 19th. But the 15th Amendment, and it's the 150th anniversary of that one, so let's keep that in mind, said that voting cannot be restricted on the basis of race. And we'll talk more about that, I think, in our questions. But, women didn't succeed in that moment in adding women to the Constitution. So, and actually they go back to a strategy of changing state legislatures for several decades. And I'm actually wearing my, on this side, my 1915 Pennsylvania Votes for Women pin as a reminder that there were, again, just many, many campaigns at the state level, and that women were really incredible political activists and lobbyists who faced multiple losses. And then in 1913, they came back, partially influenced by Alice Paul, who'd been in Britain with the English women's rights activists, who comes back and says, you know what, this state-by-state process is too slow. Let's try for a national amendment again. And she announces it with a huge national protest parade, the first one in Washington, D.C., the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. It does not endear her to him. But so this is a long process involving so many women, and again, multiple strategies. And in 1920, they are successful in amending the Constitution, again, in a moment of change, right? There were several amendments in that few years, the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th. So a real success and victory for voting rights, but as we'll talk, I think, further in our conversation, not the end of the fight by any means.
Thank you. So, I mean, one of the things that really struck me was how much they went through, right? And how hard of a fight this was, and throughout the course of time, right? So why do you think it was so important to these women to obtain the right to vote?
Well, that's that is a complicated question, and I think it helps to ask which women. As you pointed out in your introduction, the story we usually hear is about women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And for those women who were middle-class white women, the right to vote is one of the few ways in which they, well, it's not one of the few, there were many, but it was a very visible way in which they did not have equality with the men, white men in their lives. And so the vote became a real clear place that they thought they needed to fight for equality. For women of color in different communities, the vote is a tool to address issues that white women don't face. Issues like lynching, right? African American suffragists advocate for the right to vote because they want to be able to pressure the federal government to pass anti-lynching legislation. They want to be able to address Jim Crow laws and to dismantle them. And so for them, the right to vote is a tool for that. Native women see the right to vote as a tool with which they can, again, sort of force the federal government to recognize the rights of their communities. So for women of color, there are a variety of reasons that they have that are not necessarily shared by the white suffrage leaders who get the most attention.
I gotcha. So, when I think back to kind of that 1920 and really bringing in that thought process about women of color, right? When we think about it, we think that almost as if it's black and white. It's 1920 happens, whether or not it's August 18th or August 26th, and miraculously, all women now have the right to vote, theoretically, right? So you brought in women of color. Right. So talk to me a little bit about their experience and how maybe at that moment it wasn't so black and white. So what were the things that the women of color faced after that moment when it seems everything should be okay?
Right. I think it's a very good question. And I think there are a couple of different responses I'd like to make to it. The first is that the 19th Amendment doesn't grant a right to vote. Neither does the 15th. And in fact, there is no right to vote protected by the Constitution. What the 19th Amendment does is say that it cannot be restricted on the basis of sex. The 15th says it can't be restricted on the basis of race. But of course, that leaves a lot of other ways in which the right to vote can be restricted. So I want to kind of put that out there as the big context. And then in terms of the women of color who were suffragists and who were involved in this movement, they were there, again, Black women, certainly there from the very beginning. Much of this activism came out of the abolitionist movement from before the Civil War. For the other women also, they were fighting for this before 1920. They're involved in parades, they're going to suffrage meetings, they're writing articles about suffrage, they're speaking to audiences. So they're part of the fight. They're part of trying to convince men to vote to include women in these rights, right, in citizenship rights. But not all of them are able to vote in 1920 because individual state constitutions or state traditions enfranchise them for other reasons than their sex. So for example, if you are not able to access US citizenship, you cannot vote, right? Citizenship, that actually by 1920, it becomes something that, let me rephrase. Before 1920, before 1919 in World War I, there are actually a number of states that allow immigrants to vote, even if they have not yet naturalized. They have to have filled out what were called their first papers. They're often called first papers voters, so their intention to vote. So throughout the 19th century, there are upwards of, I think, 21 states that allow these first paper voters, which is something that for us seems kind of impossible. If you're not a citizen and you're not allowed to naturalize, it's much harder to vote. So Asian immigrants, and particularly Chinese immigrants after 1882, are not allowed to naturalize and become citizens. Initially, it's just the Chinese. Eventually, it is expanded to all Asian immigrants. And that's in place until after World War II. So there are Chinese immigrants living in the United States, men and women, who cannot vote because they cannot become citizens. Likewise, Native Americans, right, people who are indigenous to this continent, were considered wards of the government, so legally wards and not citizens, and so they were not able to vote, even as Chinese immigrant women and Native women were helping to fight for suffrage.
Gotcha. So I want to bring us back to, you mentioned a couple times the 15th Amendment. Mm-hmm. And the 15th Amendment talking about how voting can't be restricted on the basis of race, right? So at that time, obviously in general, men had the right to vote. And with the passage of that 15th Amendment saying that voting can't be restricted on the basis of race, mm-hmm. that then makes me feel like Black men, African-American men, or men of color now, non-white men, that allows them the opportunity not to be restricted based on that fact. So can you talk a little bit about the intersectionality of those groups when we think about the women's suffrage movement, and maybe we can even think about it in two groups, right? Where the white women's suffrages are coming from versus really seeing men, Black men, men of color, being less restricted before them. So can you talk about kind of that I don't know if controversial relationship is the right way to put it, but complicated relationship.
Yes, I mean that's a tension, certainly a major tension in this story of suffrage. As I mentioned, the idea or the language even for women's rights comes out of women's participation, Black women and white women, in the abolitionist movement in the 1820s and 30s. And it's really where a lot of women start thinking about this idea of rights, and in part because they're talking about the rights of people of African descent who are enslaved, right? And they're talking about human rights, and they're talking about rights that people don't have, and they start thinking about their own rights as women. And there's a coalition, right, of these abolitionists that's very close throughout, up through the Civil War. And it's after the war when the Constitution's being amended and this question of, okay, what do citizenship rights mean, right? The 14th Amendment creates birthright citizenship and extends citizenship to all of those people who had been formerly enslaved, but it also inserts the word male into the Constitution for the first time. And many women, and particularly white women, are concerned about this. And when the 15th Amendment is ratified, it only applies to Black men and it's not universal suffrage. And so this creates a split actually in what had formerly been this alliance. And Black women tend to argue that, right, Black men getting the right to vote is a victory for their community, and that Black men can use that right to help protect their new freedom. And some white women agree with them, famously Lucy Stone, who founds the American Women's Suffrage Association, which is a biracial suffrage group. But other white women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are really outraged by this, and their racial prejudice, right, shows in that they think that educated white women, middle-class women, should be voting before, as they say, they would put it, ignorant, formerly enslaved Black men. And their discussions about suffrage kind of fall into these categories where Black women kind of disappear, right? They're saying, well, women need the right to vote before Black men, but Black women sort of aren't in that conversation. And Black women were very much in the conversation at the time. So, for example, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who speaks at some of the, particularly the American Women's Suffrage Association meetings, who says, she famously says, white women speak of rights, but I speak of wrongs. And Frederick Douglass, who had been a major supporter of women's suffrage, who had been at Seneca Falls, who, when the idea of the right to vote was put forward as one of the demands that women wanted to put in the Declaration of Sentiments, he had supported it. In this post-war period, Stanton and Anthony sort of turn their back on him. And he says, look, Black men need this vote. We're being killed. The violence against us, we need it to protect ourselves in ways that white women don't. And so it's a really ugly moment in the suffrage movement, but that tension remains even up into the moment around the 1920s, where white suffragists are really willing to capitulate to particularly white Southern ideas about race, and to say things like, look, white women will not vote for racial equality. White women will help protect Jim Crow laws and white supremacy. And they really, many of them tried to keep Black suffragists out of their events. And Black suffragists are the ones who really insist that their fight is also a fight for voting rights, and that their voices need to be heard as well. And they're doing all kinds of activism in their own communities, as well as in sort of these moments that we think of, the suffrage parades. They're there as well.
Great, great kind of way to expound on that. Really appreciate that. And these are the things that really, aren't talked about and really should be. And I think, along those lines, you have a book where you write about six suffragists, women suffragists of color. And, in researching in advance, these are names that I had never heard of before. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe you can share 1 to 2 stories about, these women that you write about and their plight being suffragists of color.
Right. Sure. It's hard to only pick 2, but I'll do my best. I think one of the women that I didn't think I was going to write about and ended up writing about is a woman named Gertrude Simons Bonin, or Zitkalasha, who is Yangtan Sioux Nation. And she was a woman who, just had an incredible career. She was a writer and a musician, but was also someone who really spent much of her life as an advocate for her people in particular, but also for Native people more broadly in the United States. This is a moment when federal policy is based on the idea of assimilation, or of sending Native children to boarding schools to teach them to basically get rid of their culture, and to teach them to behave in what was thought of as civilized manner. And the federal government has broken up and stopped recognizing tribal governments. It's breaking up treaty protected tribally held land, and really trying to erase Native people as any kind of particular culture or political group, and blend them into the US citizenry. And she and some members of a group called the Society of American Indians really push back against this, argue that Native people actually have a lot to contribute to the future, to the nation, but also that there are these treaties, these international agreements that the federal government has signed that they need to uphold. And Bonin sees the vote and suffrage as a way that they can protect those rights. And as I mentioned, Native people weren't considered citizens, they're legally wards, until 1924, so after the 19th Amendment, when the US passes the Indian Citizenship Act. And in 1924, Bonin has lobbied for this act, and she takes the vote and just runs with it. So she forms her own organization to lobby for voting rights, to educate people, to register Native voters, to encourage them to vote. And you see national newspapers at the time start talking about the idea of a Native voting bloc. And it's obviously not on a national level. It's not going to influence maybe a federal election, but in particular states with large Native populations, it could matter. And Bonin sees it as really an amazing potential. She's stymied in this because right after 1924, many of those states like South Dakota and Montana, New Mexico, Arizona, began to pass laws that are very similar to the Jim Crow laws in the South that disenfranchise Native people. Literacy tests, at-large districting, making it hard to register, but also saying anybody who lives on tribally held land can't vote in state elections. So her struggle and the struggle for Native voting rights continues. And in fact, Native people, some of those laws are addressed in the 1965 Voting Rights Act in the Preclearance Clause that was then stripped in 2013 in Shelby v. Holder. Another woman that I write about, again, sort of faced this issue of citizenship, a woman named Mabel Pinghua Li, who was a Chinese woman who emigrates to the United States in when she was 5, under one of the very small exceptions to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Her parents were teachers and missionaries, and she becomes actually a teenage voting rights activist. Her first sort of public event is in 1912. She speaks to some of the national suffrage leaders in New York City in 1912. And the reason that she's invited to speak is that they're really interested in what's happening in China. Suffragists, we often think of it as a US-oriented movement, but there's a transnational movement. Women around the world are having these conversations. And in the 1911 revolution in China, the Republican Revolution, women's rights is on the table, and there's actually the provinces are allowed to decide for themselves if they want to allow women to vote. So women in America, white women, want to know more, and they invite Mabel Lee to speak to them. Turns out she's this amazing speaker, incredibly charismatic, and they continue to invite her back. So she becomes this conduit for information about what's happening with women's rights in China to the US suffrage movement in New York. But she can't vote in the United States. And what I think is really interesting about her story is she is helping to fight for that in the US, for US citizens. But she's also speaking to her fellow citizens in China through the Chinese Students Association, through publications aimed at kind of Chinese expats in the US as well as in China, about how their new nation needs to include women's rights. So again, this sort of transnational perspective, and a perspective from a community that is very different from, again, these white suffragists that we usually learn about.
That's really interesting to me, because you actually, touched upon this in terms of, we here in the US often think about the movement, right, as a United States thing, but really it was not only was it diverse, but it was also multinational, right? And there are these suffragists all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
A question that just kind of came up to me as we think about women obtaining the right to vote maybe in other countries outside of the US. Do you think that there was any pressure, for the 19th Amendment to happen because women are obtaining the right to vote outside of the US? So did you see any kind of correlation between that at all?
Certainly the white suffragists who are inviting Mabel Lee to speak, and they invite her actually to be at the head of the 1912 New York City suffrage parade, which was a massive, 5,000 women, it's a huge parade. And they have her front and center. And actually the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the biggest national organization, Anna Howard Shaw, marches in that parade. There's another group of women from Chinatown, Mabel Lee's mother and some other women, who march, and Anna Howard Shaw marches right behind them, and she carries a banner that says NASA, which are the initials for her organization, NASA catching up with China. And there's one of their strategies is to try to shame white American men by saying, look, these women in China, and remember that at this moment, the Chinese are the only group of people in the world who are not allowed to naturalize as US citizens. They're seen as that foreign. There are a lot of stereotypes that I could go into, but we can kind of imagine them. And they're saying, and they seem to have enfranchised women before the United States, right? So white suffragists certainly use that. They also use other slightly more racist strategies of saying, again, how can Black men or immigrant men or Chinese men who are citizens, how can they vote before we do? And the other sort of place that the transnational, at least before 1920, comes in is the example of the British movement, which is a much more radical movement. And actually a lot of anti-suffragists use that to say, oh, those women over in Britain who are, breaking windows and planting bombs and going on hunger strikes, like that's so unladylike. And use that to criticize suffrage in the United States. So it's certainly part of this larger discussion. And Carrie Chapman Catt, who becomes the president of NASA in that final push for the amendment, she initially is she's president of the International Suffrage Alliance, and takes a world tour in 1912, where her final stop is in China, where she meets some of these Chinese women involved in the revolution who are elected to the legislature in Canton province. And so again, this is definitely something that is broader than the US.
Great. So I want to kind of shift us, and we've been talking about the past quite a bit, but I think that what's very important is our ability to kind of draw parallels between the past and the future, right? Or the past and the present, better said. So 1920 was an election year. 2020 is an election year. So when we kind of think about the context of that, 100 years later, you know, how, from your perspective, do we tie it together? This journey that you know, maybe didn't necessarily begin in 1920, but it's still not ending in 2020. So can you bring us here to 2020 and talk a little bit about where we are now?
Sure. I think there are two ways I'd want to think about that. One is sort of what is the state of voting rights broadly in 2020? You know, again, 1920 was this real step forward where voting rights, the restriction of sex was removed, but it left other restrictions. And so sort of what kind of restrictions do we face today? And I do think that all of the suffragists would want us to think critically about that and to think about, you know, how are people being kept from voting? Is it as explicit as using sex, or is it much more implicit, like, you know, some of these Jim Crow voting laws in the South that lowered voter participation across the board? They were aimed at stopping African Americans from voting, but if you look at voting rates in those states before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it was low for everyone, right? And so thinking about voter turnout and voting rates and how we can encourage more people to vote, right? How can we be a nation where voting is something that's celebrated and where everybody is involved in it, right? Why aren't people voting, and how can we address that? I think the other place that's interesting to look in is particularly, you know, pertinent to the 2020 election is women participating as elected officials. Women run for office at multiple levels before 1920, right? Women who can vote in their states, and many could run for office, particularly for school positions, even before they got full suffrage rights. And after 1920, they continue. So actually the first woman of color to run for office in the United States is a Latina, or she would have called herself an Hispana, in New Mexico. Her name was Nina Otero Warren. And she runs as the congressional candidate for the Republican Party in 1922. The Democrats of New Mexico also nominate a Hispanic woman, and actually they each nominate an Anglo and Hispanic woman to run for office. And while Nina Otero Warren loses, she gains national attention for this, along with the other women who are running. So the push for women to try to not just vote and influence politics that way, but also serve as representatives and to be part of right, governance, structures of governance, was also part of what the suffragists envisioned. Those numbers, right, are still pretty low, but in 2020, the number of women of color in particular running for office is higher than I think it has ever been. And of course, having Kamala Harris on the vice presidential ticket is historic. She is the first woman of color that a major political party has nominated. And that's huge. And again, she sort of stands on the shoulders of these women who were suffrage activists, who were involved in continuing the fight up through the civil rights movement. Women like Shirley Chisholm, who ran for office, by Patsy Takemoto Mink, who was the first woman of color in Congress, a Japanese American woman from Hawaii. So there's a long history of this and of women really pushing those boundaries. So both the state of voting rights and the health of voting rights in the country, and also, you know, who has access, who gets to represent the voters, I think are the two things that we can think about. The long history and legacy, and where we are. What is the state of the nation?
Well, you stole my thunder because I was going to ask you about the legacy that these women have left, and I think you have encapsulated that greatly in terms of, we still have work to do. There are still roadblocks for voting, even though it may not be as overt as being written in a constitution, but there's still opportunities for improvement. And women in general, as we see now in 2020, continue to make strides. And even just learning about these women helps to encourage me and helps me to feel how even more important my vote is, as a woman and as a woman of color. So with that, I wanted to kind of transition over and open it up to our audience to submit questions. As Ambassador Shapiro mentioned at the onset of the call, there's a Q&A box. So if you'd like to submit a question, please do that through our Q&A box. And right now, I do have one question, so I'll go ahead and field that to Kathleen. The question comes from Jorge, and Jorge says, how do you teach about this in elementary school? So I'm assuming that is, really kind of bringing this wealth of information to a younger audience.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there actually are a variety of resources that have been created over the course of this centennial, which is part of the real excitement. The Library of Congress has some great links. The American Library Association created a document that has suggested readings for different levels, elementary, middle, and high school. I was trying to find that, but I couldn't pull it up right away. I'll look for it. The Women's Centennial Commission that was created by Congress, which I think is found at Women's Vote 100, has a series of short articles. I wrote a couple of them on some of the women that I've discussed here, that along with resources to try to help give educators opportunities. Radcliffe at Harvard University has something called a suffrage syllabus, which is probably at a higher level, but has a lot of primary sources and suggested readings. So there's a variety of really amazing resources out there for teachers. And I would hope, I'd love to see some of this work kind of make its way into children's books, right, that are accessible to young adults and children.
Great. We have another question that just came up from Charlotte, and I'll do my best. How are Jim Crow type laws and state laws that restrict access for women of color still being supported by white women in the two parties? How are women of color today pressing for change? And how can white women actively support voter access for all? So that's multifaceted here, but let's go back to the Jim Crow laws. So I'm going to try to get the essence of this. The Jim Crow laws passed by the states, obviously restricting women of color and just people of color, African Americans specifically. It seems that they, in some form or fashion, were supported by the white women suffragists at that time. Do you see that, or were they primarily against it?
Oh, I think there are definitely places where you can see cooperation and alliance. But I think on the whole, that after 1920, most white women didn't get the message that there were still, either deliberately ignored it or didn't hear it, that there were still, right, a lot of people who couldn't vote. I mean, that is when they were able to speak to white audiences. That's what the suffragists of color continued to say, right, we still don't have the right to vote, or here are the ways in which it's limited, please help. And they didn't as enthusiastically. Alice Paul and the National Women's Party hears some of these pleas and decides that the Equal Rights Amendment will be their focus. And Paul kind of believes that that will solve everybody's trouble. And of course, that's still in process. The League of Women Voters was a little more open, and the League of Women Voters is founded right after, right, that's sort of the transition after the ratification of the 19th. And they're more open to Black women in particular, but again, it's not their priority. And so I think one of the lessons we can take is that, voting rights and the health of voting rights affects us all, and that we should all be concerned with it. I'm going to offer two places to start. One is, if you want to know more about this, there's a really wonderful book by Carol Anderson called One Person, No Vote, that really describes, does a good job of talking about how voting rights were restricted by Jim Crow and then by other means after, say, the Voting Rights Act of 65. And then, and I think Stacey Abrams, right, is someone who has really taken up voting rights as her fight, and is doing incredible work. And both of those women are African-American women, and I think it's no coincidence that those are the things that they're concerned with.
I have one last question that comes from Cynthia, and I like this question because it's actually been a question that's been on my mind. When we think about the women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, why is it that these women are encapsulated in our history books, and we, as American citizens, know those names all too well, yet the women of color that, as we've all talked about, were extremely impactful, they're largely left off. We largely don't learn about them. So I want to end kind of with that question.
All right, great. And I see that there's a couple more, and I'll try to answer them after we sign off in the answer, if I can. But that's a really good question, and it has to do with sort of how history gets written, and in particular, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were really smart about this. They knew that most people weren't going to remember the history of suffrage unless they wrote it. And so they wrote a 6-volume history of women's suffrage themselves that sort of is published over time. And they really center their story, right? It's a huge volume, and they really focus on the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which initially was theirs before it joins with the American, and they put themselves at the center. And so that was the place that a lot of historians started when they said, well, what's up with this suffrage history? Well, hey, here's 6 volumes of it, right? Now, women of color were also producing things, and Carrie Williams Clifford, who's an African-American poet and writer that I write about, she's constantly, in her poetry and in some of her other writings, trying to build a history of Black women's participation. She actually writes an article for The Crisis that describes the Black women who march in that 1913 suffrage parade. She names them, she says where they march and what they do. And so she's trying to put it into the historical record, but that wasn't always a place that historians looked for suffragists, right? She's not mentioned in the history of women's suffrage. So, and that's where they started and built a story that really centered Stanton and Anthony. So white suffragists participate in this. They create a collection for the Smithsonian immediately. The pen that the Secretary of State uses to sign this into the Constitution, that immediately gets donated to the Smithsonian. So the beginning of that collection also centers these white suffragists. And then that's what historians built on without looking in other places. And part of what's so exciting about this anniversary is a lot of scholars have started looking in those other places and listening to those other voices. And so that expands our sense of the story.
Well, there's so much more that we could talk about, and this is so rich with information that, you know, for me, I'm back in school, but I know that we have to wrap up our program. Thank you, Kathleen. It's been a fantastic discussion and very eye-opening and enlightening for me. And I'd like to thank Ambassador Shapiro and the World Affairs Council for allowing me the opportunity to moderate this discussion today. So with that, I will turn it back over to Ambassador Shapiro. You're on mute, Ambassador.
Lord, what a rookie error. I apologize. Naima, thank you so much for moderating. You can have my job because you did it better than I do. And I'm going to, if you get tired of Bank of America, come to the World Affairs Council and you can be our moderator full time. Kathleen, thank you very much. I know it's the beginning of your semester as well, and you're having to wrestle with online and in-person, the whole thing that every university in the country is dealing with. And so I wish you well, and thank you so much for devoting so much time to us today. This has just been terrific. I've got loads of questions. I might have to send them to y'all. To everybody in the audience, we need your help. Please join the World Affairs Council. If you are a member, please renew your membership. If you're not a member, join. And if you can, make a donation. We're suffering like all nonprofits are because of COVID. I will see you all tomorrow at 1. We have a program with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. We'll talk about the new nuclear arms race. His favorite quote, I love this, is our nuclear weapons policy is obsolete and dangerous. I know because I helped design it. So come listen and join in with Secretary of Defense Bill Perry tomorrow at 1, not at noon. Next Wednesday at 2, we have Brett Lacey, Associate Director of Democracy Programs at the Carter Center, who's works on monitoring elections abroad. And so what she's going to talk about is protecting elections at home and abroad. That's next Wednesday at 2. I want to thank Kathleen and Naima one more time. I want to thank our staff, Fernanda Lucchine, our Executive Director, Valerin Lopez DeFrank, our office manager, and Ladarian Gillette, who produces this program and does a great job with it. Thank you all. Thanks for joining us today. I hope we'll see you tomorrow at 1. Bye-bye.